So the H.L. Hunley submarine, famous for being the first submarine to sink an enemy ship in a combat situation. It was not the first submarine ever built. The concept, the idea of a submarine had been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But it wasn't until the mid-19th century that the technology to make a true submersible came into being, that being the Industrial Revolution and the advent of factories that could produce large amounts of plate iron. Now, military engineers and private engineers and machinists could build lots of different things that they couldn't build before. And so the Hunley was part of this transformation of technology where a small group of investors and engineers decided to build the Pioneer in New Orleans in 1862. After New Orleans fell, the Pioneer was abandoned in New Orleans, and so they moved to Mobile and they built two more vessels, the American Diver and then the H.L. Hunley. American Diver was lost in Mobile Bay due to an accident. Not to be deterred, the guys then started working on their third vessel. As I said, it was plate iron that was used, wrought plate iron for most of the hull. We don't know exactly, but they do talk about using an old locomotive boiler as the foundation of it. This is just an offhand comment in a letter. We don't know if that's true or not, but we do know that the Hunley was very small. It was only 4 feet high, 3.5 feet wide, roughly corresponding to boilers of the period. They extended it vertically to give more room for the crew, and we think that may have played a role in the final design. The hull was only 3/8 of an inch thick, fairly small, but it didn't need to do a lot more than just keep the water out. The intention here is very important. They were never intending to dive deep or be underwater for a long period of time. This was just a way to sneak up to an enemy ship and deliver their payload. The final weapon system of Hunley was a spar-mounted torpedo, which they would bring up to the side of a vessel they were trying to attack. They would sneak up and set it off through various means. You can see over here better diagram of how the Hunley operated with its spar torpedo. The limitation they had in addition to that was propulsion. The only engine they had available at the time in the mid-19th century was a steam engine, which isn't going to work on a submersible because you need to go underwater. Steam engine requires air. So they went to the next best or only option they had, which was human-powered. So they put a crew of 7 men turning a hand crank inside the vessel, and that was the propulsion method they used to move around. All right, after several months of training, George Dixon and the third and final crew were prepared to make an attack. Offshore of Charleston, there was a blockading fleet, the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, commanded by Admiral Dahlgren. His flagship, the USS New Ironsides, was on station. It was an ironclad, wooden-hulled warship. This fleet comprised it had about a dozen or so wooden-hulled vessels like this one. This is the USS Housatonic, the ship that the Hunley eventually attacked. Housatonic was fairly new, built in 1862 in Boston. It was about 200 feet long with a crew of about 165. It had several large deck guns. Basically the workhorse, this sloop of war, the workhorse of the U.S. Navy at the time, but it had a wooden hull, which made it a good target for Hunley because their explosive charge could damage a wooden hull. It'd be less effective against an iron-hulled warship. February 17, 1864, they left Breach Inlet, one of the barrier islands off of Charleston, and went 4 miles offshore to where Housatonic was hanging off a bow anchor. This was a night attack. About 8:30, they were spotted off the starboard bow, about 2 ship lengths according to the lookout. So that's about 400 feet. And they moved parallel to Housatonic. Now we know this from the testimony of the surviving members of Housatonic. This is our account of the battle. And then swung in and came in perpendicular to the hull about the location of the mizzenmast. Again, distilled information from the eyewitness accounts of the crew of Housatonic. They sat here for a second and then set off their charge, punching a hole, we believe, in the side of Housatonic. This damage was significant. As Housatonic was sinking, the crew reports seeing furniture coming up to the surface, as if they had blown a hole below decks into one of the wardrooms, or one of the lounges, or the officers' quarters, or that kind of thing. and Housatonic was on the bottom within 10 minutes. The explosive charge that Hunley used to do this was a spar-mounted torpedo, when we don't know the size of the torpedo, of course, because it's gone. But looking at what they were testing, their largest charge was up to 135 pounds of black powder. So you'd have a copper canister of 135 pounds of powder, probably fine rifle powder, that was set off. We don't know the trigger mechanism. That's also gone. We have evidence of wire in the vessel in Hunley, so we think that it may have been a wire trigger that ran out. Now, wire fuse was something that was used on cannons. Basically, they pull the line. There's a friction primer that shoots a jet of fire into the main charge and sets it off. This would have been very easy for them to configure that. You do have to contend with a wire coming back. There is a possibility they could have used a percussion fuse, basically nodules on the end of the torpedo that would, when they hit something, would set it off. It's a little bit more risky because it requires other things to happen, but we don't really know. After this event, Hunley disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to Hunley. It was last seen next to Housatonic as it was going down, but as you can understand, the crew of Housatonic stopped paying attention to Hunley once they started to sink and started getting into the lifeboats and trying to hang on. Fortunately for them, even though this was 4 miles offshore, Charleston has a very gradual increase in depth, and so it was only 30 feet of water, meaning that Housatonic, with 15 feet of below the water line normally, hit the bottom, and the rigging and the masts and everything were still sticking out of the water, so they could all hold on. And so only 5 members of Housatonic died, men that were below decks when the charge went off. The rest survived and provided testimony of how this attack unfolded. But nobody saw Hunley anymore after this point. And so this mystery began, a legend in Charleston, continuing until 1995, when a survey team funded by the author Clive Cussler found the Hunley, not here, but 1,000 feet away, 1,000 feet towards further out to sea from where Housatonic was. So the question began, well, how did it get there? And what happened to the submarine? If it didn't get pulled down by Housatonic, then why was the submarine lost? How did the crew die? In 2000, the submarine was recovered and brought to this facility here, Clemson's Warren Lash Conservation Center, where we've been conserving the vessel. We excavated the interior, recovered all the artifacts, the personal belongings of the crew, and the skeletal remains of the crew themselves, and began a detailed analysis of all of these guys, all the artifacts, and the hull itself, trying to figure out what happened and solve this mystery, and tell the story of these guys that lost their lives in this historic event. We found the remains. They were entirely skeletal. In other words, that they had decomposed to the point where bacteria had eaten all of the tissue, most of the clothing. They had cotton, obviously undergarments and things, that was gone. We found a few fragments. Most of the textiles that were preserved were wool, because it's a little bit more durable. And so we had great skeletal evidence from the crew, even if their tissue and their clothing didn't survive. And we were able to take a lot of data from that. We were able to examine the skeletal remains for any pathologies or unhealed wounds. One of the ideas was that they had broken bones, or maybe the captain had been shot when he was approaching, because we know the Housatonic fired upon Hunley. It was coming in. Maybe we'd find a bullet in his head or something. You know, and any explanation we could find as to what happened to these guys. And unfortunately, for that avenue of research, we didn't find any damage to the crew at all. No broken bones, not even micro fractures. We didn't find any small unhealed anything. So that was something that we could kind of rule out. But we were able to study these guys for toxicology, pathology, and then take DNA samples. Our DNA samples are good because of the preservation of the skeletal remains. We could take bone marrow and tooth pulp and send these out for analysis. And it's been very productive and helpful. One of the things we found out was that there's an isotope you can test in the human body that can be recovered from skeletal remains that indicates their diet. That's a big clue for us, because in the mid-19th century, diet and food was not universal like it is now. In the United States, they consume corn, maize. In Europe, they did not. They didn't have it. Corn leaves an isotope in the body that can be tracked as far as how long you've been consuming, how long an individual's been consuming corn. And what we found was that half of our crew had a late in life introduction of corn. They were immigrants. They had moved to the United States. In some cases, fairly recently, the second guy, Arnold Becker, had just started consuming corn, which tracks because he's in his late teens, and we believe he's from Europe. We've done other DNA comparisons and lined that up with the historical record of each of these guys. So we have military records for most of them, some we don't. So we have a pretty good idea of who these individuals were. Obviously, George Dixon we knew from the beginning. He's got stuff on his body with his name on it, so we know that's George Dixon. And the rest of the guys, we've pieced it together from their military records. Not unsurprisingly, or not surprisingly, a lot of these guys have naval backgrounds. They served in the U.S. Navy just a few years before and were in the Confederate Navy, although we have two guys probably from the German light artillery here in Charleston. And then Dixon was an Army guy from Mobile. So one man we haven't been able to find military records for, and we don't really know who he is. We have names that were reported to us which helped us track down their records. And sure enough, you've got a guy who was detached to work on the H.L. Hunley submersible and then listed as missing in action, later confirmed dead. So we've used that. So combine all that together, we've got a pretty good idea of the crew profiles of the men that were on board Hunley. And I think it's really interesting when you look at the immigrants too, especially someone that just got here, because not only are they getting involved in a war in their new home that they have no investment in, really, but then they're doing something risky, like getting involved in this venture, this mission that killed everybody else. They know about the previous two crews that lost their lives, yet they're still willing to get on board and try and do something. What is their motivation? Why are they trying to do this? I find that fascinating. So we'll never know exactly what they were thinking, but understanding their backgrounds helps us get a better understanding of who they were and may give us some clues as to why they did what they did. The physical remains of the crew have given us some clues as to what did or did not happen. And one of the interesting things that we discovered early on was that each member of the crew died on board Hunley, decomposed, turned skeletal, just their bones remained. And it was interesting because we had kind of thought that if they go down because water's flooding in the submarine, how do you die at sea? Most often, you're going to drown. Something goes wrong, which is a possibility, or was a possibility, until we looked at the distribution of these remains, and we found that instead of having a couple guys underneath one of the hatches trying to get out, they were in fact perfectly distributed at their stations, their crank stations. The captain was where he was supposed to be to navigate the vessel. The other 7 crewmen were, their bones were right below where they were sitting on the bench turning the crank. No sign of panic. A simple drowning explanation for what happened just doesn't fit. They had to travel 4 miles to get to Housatonic, make their attack, and then travel 4 miles back. And here's the problem they have. To get back, they have to contend with the currents and tides. And one of the things we realized is that they took the tide from shore. There was an outgoing, it's called an ebb tide. Tide is receding from the shore out to sea. That's going to be very helpful for them, and it makes a lot of sense. They're very slow. We estimate a cruising speed of about 1 to 2 knots. They could sprint maybe 3 to 4. This is based on the hull form of the Hunley and the size of its propeller and what would be capable, what kind of force they could generate from turning that propeller. So 1 to 2 knots cruising is what they're going to take out. If there's an outgoing tide, they're going to get an assistance. They're going to get a boost. We have the weather from that night from the Housatonic log. There was an ebb tide of about 1 to 2 knots. So now they're 2 to 4 knots, leaving to come back out. But if they want to turn around and go back, their 1 to 2 knots propulsion speed and is not going to overcome, really, the outgoing tide. So what they have to do is wait for the tide to end. The slack tide begins at 10:20. The attack took place at 8:45, which means they have now basically an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes before slack tide truly arrives. Now they can go back before that because it's a gradual thing. The ebb tide lessens until slack tide. So that 1 to 2 knots ebb tide is going to turn down to 1 knot, then a half a knot, at some point they could maybe start making headway getting back to shore if that's what they wanted to do. But time is not in their favor in this regard. The problem with the submarine is you don't have an anchor, right? It's more like, I always equate it to, if you really want to conceptualize this and understand it, it's like swimming. If you're swimming out here, right, and there's currents and tides, if you don't swim against it, it's going to move you. You're going to be heading, if they don't do anything with this ebb tide, they're going to keep going out to sea unless they keep moving the crank, turning the propeller, and providing propulsive force to the submarine. The submarine needs to be moving forward to counter this. It needs to be moving forward to steer. The rudder doesn't work if there's no water flowing against it or along it. So these guys have a problem if they're out here. They have to do something. What are their options? How are they going to get back to shore? So one of the other things we looked at, of course, is that if the crew died in place, maybe something else caused their deaths. So we looked at the blast of the torpedo itself. We did a study beginning in 2013 with the U.S. Navy, the Surface Warfare Center in Carter Rock, Maryland. What they do for the U.S. Navy is study hull response to various blasts. So they take Navy hulls and they say, how do these respond to a torpedo or to other, and as you can imagine, they've been looking at a lot of non-conventional explosive devices and what that would do to a Navy hull. Not just the hull itself, as far as buckling, but also the crew that are inside it. They want to know if there's somebody down in a compartment next to this, what happens to them? How can they make their hulls better to resist these kind of attacks? And they were very fascinated by this and took on the project. We partnered with them and did a study of our specific situation where we have a hull of a certain size made of a certain material, 3/8 of an inch of iron, and then how it was constructed impacts its rigidity and stability, kind of. And then also the charge of the torpedo itself, the 135 pounds black powder. Now we don't know if it's 135 pounds, we can't confirm that, but that's the largest. That historically was documented them testing out and using potentially. So we started with that because we wanted to see what's the best chance that they have to be injured by the torpedo blast. Let's start with the biggest. If it's smaller than that, then it's even less of a chance. And we were hoping this would give us a clue. Maybe the crew was knocked out, maybe the crew was disabled, or injured, or unable to respond to a flooding situation. That would allow water to pour in, submarine goes down, and they drown, but they can't respond to it because they're either knocked out or disabled. And after a lot of simulation studying, they have a lot of software that they use for the Navy that they can apply to this. And then they actually did 3 live fire tests at Aberdeen Proving Grounds where they set off a comparable charge and measured the force that was generated. And I said, so, does this give us any answers? And they said, unfortunately, no, because black powder does not act like a modern explosive. It doesn't detonate. It's more like a slow burn, more like a combustion of a can of gasoline or something like that. It blows up, and it's very destructive close in, but it's a very slow burn relative to TNT, so it doesn't create anything approaching a shock wave. Because if a high explosive goes off and you're in the vicinity, that shock wave could kill you more than anything else, because that is a very powerful wave of force that comes at you. A black powder doesn't create that. It is not that type of explosive. So we kind of had to rule that one out. That would have been an easy one. If we could show that, that would explain a lot. But not all of it, because one of the things that we found when we started looking into this, here's the final mission, right? Oh, here's Housatonic, and here's where Hunley ended up. This is 1,000 feet away. Current is moving this way. If they were incapacitated or killed even, what's to stop the submarine from continuing to drift away? They're on the surface when they make their attack. How do they get to the bottom? They either have to sink or they have to go intentionally. If they sink and drift, they're going in this direction, not this direction. This is against the current. This is following the ebb, but what you have out here is an addition to this, and we know this because we have the log of Housatonic that tells us the tidal current's going this way. That's a combination of the ebb current and the offshore currents. All they know is they drop a line in the water and measure the location. This is, their real world observations of what's going on out here the night of the attack. So Hunley should have ended up in this direction. The fact that it ended up this way almost guarantees that they steered it. There's no way for it to drift that direction. If they did sink immediately, University of Michigan charted the sinking path. We take the smallest opening that we found on the submarine that's not corrosion and use that to enter water. How long before it overcomes the reserve buoyancy in the submarine, the stuff that's keeping it on the surface, and starts sinking it? And where would it end up? It would sink and hit the bottom about 400 feet from Housatonic. The fact that they made 1,000 feet away, they can't sink to that spot. Physically not. From the evidence we have, it's not going to happen that way. Not in that direction and not that distance. And if they were on the surface and floating and were killed or incapacitated, they would have been miles away. They would have just kept drifting. So something else must have happened. They must have been under power at some point after the attack to get to where they did, because it's contrary to where the current flows would have pushed them. So recently, we've begun looking at other options. So now we're looking at the air quality inside the submarine. When they were spotted 200 feet away from Housatonic. We don't know when they last closed the hatches. We would assume they would refresh the air periodically on their way out because they have no reserved air inside. The air is going to get foul after a while of 7 guys cranking. Even if they're kind of just cruising, they're breathing. They're consuming oxygen. They're creating CO2. Venting the submarine was never part of the design because they were not supposed to be out there that long. You know, the initial design of the vessel was to be closed up and dive, 15, 20 minutes, maybe a half an hour, and then come up and you're on the surface again. These guys are going a long distance, longer than they ever intended, to get out to Housatonic. And during that time, they would have probably tried to refresh the air. They did have a snorkel system in there where they could use a bellows to pump in fresh air and pump out bad air. We don't know how effective it was. It was on board, so maybe they used it on the way out there. But at some point they were spotted, at the point they were spotted was 400 feet away at 8:30. By the lookout, we have the account. Robert Fleming saw them and didn't know what it was at first. And then he called an officer over, and they said it was a log. And then he called another officer and said, well, wait a second, it's moving against the current. It's not a log. They knew about these Confederate torpedo boats. So let's assume that they had 100% fresh air at that point, 21% oxygen. Unlikely, because they just went 4 miles to get out there, but let's just give them the best starting scenario. It took them 15 minutes. So 8:30, 8:45 is the attack. That's 15 minutes of vigorous exercise. They're going to go to sprint mode at that point to swing in as fast as possible. They're expecting at any moment to be blown out of the water. If Housatonic can manage to get one of its big deck guns over, it's going to sink them. So they're kind of going. They're, exertion, but also fear, adrenaline. There's a lot of heavy breathing going on. By the time they hit Housatonic, at 8:45, our estimates are that they've dropped from 21% to 18% oxygen. We know the volume inside. It's closed now because they've locked the hatches down. And CO2 has crept up to 3%. Okay, they're fine, right? Candle's gonna have a little bit difficulty burning, but that's okay. They've gotten there, they're gonna make their attack, and then they disappear. They ended up 1,000 feet away, so how long would that take? Well, we don't really know. Judging on this, let's double that. It was 15 minutes of sprint to get 400 feet, 1,000 feet, maybe longer, let's say 30 minutes. We don't really know. We don't know how hard they were cranking to get away. Probably at first, initially, going in reverse pretty fast, because again, they're worried about being killed and sinking. They are steering, so we'll give them another 30 minutes. By the time they hit the bottom, 30 minutes later, they're now down to 16% oxygen, 4% CO2, and now they're in trouble. Because, as I mentioned, they're probably doing this because the tides are not in their favor. It is now 9:15. They have 1 hour and 5 minutes to wait until slack tide for them to even have a chance to return to shore. In addition, Housatonic is still sitting on the bottom, but is very much active. It's a beehive of activity. Boats are out, and one of these boats goes a mile away and finds the USS Canandaigua and says, hey, we've been sunk. So Canandaigua slips their anchor, full speed ahead, and moves in to rescue the crew of Houstonic and possibly attack whatever sank them. So they have another warship coming in for support. This is a dangerous place for Hunley to be. Unfortunately for George Dixon, the captain, he's trying to time all this stuff and see how long they can stay. Well, what we found is that his pocket watch that he was using to navigate is broken. We can look at the time on the watch. It stopped about 8:46. So something happened during the attack to stop his pocket watch. Now these watches are very fragile. You drop them on the ground, they stop. It kicks the wheels off. If you immerse them in water, they stop. We don't think water was the case, but any kind of shock or collision or bang would potentially stop it. So now he's on the bottom and he can't tell the time because his watch is broken. And also, by the time they get to the bottom, it is unlikely the candle is going to burn because the oxygen now has dropped to 16%. They have to wait 45 minutes. Unfortunately for them, by 82 minutes after first being spotted, after they close the hatch, they're down to 13% oxygen and 5% CO2. What happens, the CO2 is the big killer because it starts causing confusion, vomiting, hypoxia is also going to contribute. These guys are not, and the confusion means poor decision making. They're not going to think straight anymore. They're under the effect of a very dangerous environment that's almost impossible to recover from. And this is 82 minutes in, they have to wait to 90, they need another half an hour before even thinking about. At that point, Canandaigua comes in at 9:30. Canandaigua steam engines make a lot of noise. Bum, 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 you're gonna hear it. 1,000 feet away sounds like a distance, but sound travels. It's gonna sound like that activity is right on top of them, further discouraging them to move. But I think at that point, it's too late. They can't, Dixon's almost incapable of making any kind of rational decision, like, hey, let's go back up to the surface, assuming they could even do that. If he just has to wait a little bit longer, he doesn't really know what time it is. Maybe he's gonna wait until the noise goes away. Decisions are gonna be poorly made. And the likely scenario is they just eventually slipped into unconsciousness and died.